E raised his glass and smiled. To Isolde, he said, "My inspiration, my reason for building all of this." Everyone clapped, except me. I was standing 10 feet away holding the wine list for the event I funded, the company I built, the man I once called my future. But tonight, I wasn't even in a speech. Where are you listening from in the world? And if you've ever been erased like this, subscribe. I have a story to tell. My name is Verena Locke. I'm 40 from San Luis Obispo. I used to be a financial planner. I had a condo by the coast, a garden I loved, a rescue dog named Mabel, and a quiet life I built on my own. Then I met Dorian. He had a sketchbook, a broken prototype of a chair he swore would change the industry, and a smile that made promises without needing words. He didn't ask for money, he asked for belief. And I gave it. I sold the condo, I cashed out my retirement fund, I let my clients go, all to fund a company that didn't even have a name yet. But he had the passion and I had the plan. He called it us. "We're building something together," he'd whisper at 1 a.m. While I stayed up balancing spreadsheets and emailing suppliers he couldn't afford to call. I built the infrastructure. He pitched the dream. For a while, I told myself we were equals, that his vision and my execution were two halves of the same whole. But somewhere along the way, his name became the logo, and mine faded into silent footnotes. I wasn't on the website, I wasn't on the payroll, I wasn't even listed on the founding documents because he said it's cleaner this way. Investors don't like messy cap tables. I nodded, like a good partner, like a future wife. He gave me a silver ring with no stone and called it a promise. And I wore it, like proof of purpose, like proof that all this wasn't just a transaction. But tonight, watching him raise that glass to someone else, I realized it had never been our dream. It was always his, and I was just the scaffolding. The part meant to be removed once the structure stood tall. He always left tabs open. Spotify, Pinterest, SketchUp, and usually his inbox. That night, he asked me to print a document, something for the venue. I walked over to his laptop. He was in the shower, steam rising behind the frosted glass, music playing. One tab blinked. Subject line: cap table update, investor version. I don't know what made me click. Maybe the years, maybe the silence, maybe the fact that deep down, I already knew. There it was, plain text. A new ownership breakdown. Dorian 49%, Isolde Vance 30%, others 21%. No mention of me, no footnote, no asterisk. Just a clean slate, a version of his company where I never existed. And below it, another email thread, marked confidential, legal counsel only. He wrote, "She'll push back, but she has no legal standing. Nothing's in writing. We'll let the press assume she was just support staff." I scrolled up. The email before that, a photo of me, smiling beside him at the old workshop. Captioned, "Optics only. She's not relevant moving forward." My fingers froze on the trackpad. He was right. Nothing was in writing. Because I trusted him. Because love to me was enough. But now I knew he was already writing me out. And Isolde, she wasn't just his PR manager. She was his future. I closed the laptop, wiped my hands, and poured myself a glass of water. I didn't cry. I just stared at the condensation sliding down the glass and thought, if he erased me on paper, what would he do once I was no longer useful at all? The dinner was at Haven and Hearth, our favorite place back when we still said ours. It was the soft launch party. Investors, press, influencers who didn't know who actually paid for the chairs they were sitting on. I wasn't officially on the guest list, but I showed up, quiet, understated, observing. That's how I saw her first, the woman in red. She was laughing with his assistant. One heel kicked back her fingers, grazing the edge of his wine glass. My wine glass, the exact vintage I had picked 2 years ago for our engagement dinner. 2013 Barolo, full-bodied. He once said it reminded him of me, rich, sharp, takes time to understand. Now he handed it to her like it meant nothing. She took a sip, wrinkled her nose, said too dry, and he laughed. He didn't defend it, didn't correct her. He just waved the sommelier over and said, she prefers something softer, sweeter, something new. I stood still, not angry, not embarrassed, just aware. He wasn't erasing me like a villain. He was editing me like I was a draft that no longer suited the brand. When she leaned in and whispered something, he smiled the way he used to with me just before saying something that made me feel seen. Except now I wasn't. He raised his glass again. To future partnerships, he said. And the woman who brings the real magic. I didn't need to guess who he meant. It wasn't just business. It wasn't just love. It was something colder. Rebranding, and I was the part he was phasing out. There was an account Dorian never touched. We called it the Legacy Fund, his words. It was the first 120,000 I wired in. We agreed it would sit untouched as a reminder of where the company began. I checked it once a year, out of habit, out of sentiment. But that night after the dinner, I logged in. Not for nostalgia, for clarity. Balance $2, 713.42. I blinked. It used to hold 6 figures. Now, barely enough to cover a weekend in Napa. I pulled the statements. The withdrawals weren't massive. They were subtle, calculated. Dinner reservations, spa packages. A week-long stay at Meadowmere Retreat, booked under Isolda's name, paid by LLF Enterprises. That was the shell company we created. It stood for Lock & Wells Foundation. Now it stood for her comfort. One transaction caught my eye. A wire transfer labeled consulting fee, Ivance, $1,800. For consulting, she was never authorized to provide. I stared at the screen. The numbers didn't lie. He wasn't just phasing me out. He was bleeding me out. Piece by piece, expense by expense, under names I once helped create. I printed every statement, slipped them into a black folder, wrote one word on the front. Proof, not just of theft, but of something deeper. Of betrayal with spreadsheets, of erasure in Excel. He thought the account was sleeping. He didn't know the only thing dormant was my silence, and tonight it woke up. The collection launch was in 48 hours. Models, stylists, photographers flown in from LA. Everything had to be perfect. I dropped by the showroom early, pretended I was just checking the lighting. No one questioned me. They still thought I was someone. That's when I saw it, a mannequin by the front window, wearing a white silk gown. High neckline, draped sleeves, minimalist train, my design. Not officially, but I knew every stitch. It was the dress I sketched 2 years ago for a wedding that never happened. Dorian said it was too soon to make it real, so I folded the drawing, tucked it away. I never showed it to anyone, never submitted it to the collection. But there it was on display, featured, named. I walked closer. A small tag pinned at the waistline, and the Isolde. I didn't speak, just stared at it, the silk, the seams, the shape of something that once carried hope. Now it carried her name. She wasn't just wearing the company. She was wearing my place, the place I was told wasn't ready, the life I was told would happen eventually, the dress I was told wasn't our focus right now. And yet, here it was, real, marketed, named after someone who had never sacrificed a single thing. I didn't touch it, didn't rip it, didn't ask questions. I just took out my phone, snapped one photo, and whispered to no one. Now I know exactly what I'm taking back. The folder wasn't heavy. It was black, matte, no logo, no label. Inside printouts, screenshots, bank statements, email threads with dates and signatures, all quiet things. All the truth I wasn't supposed to keep. I slipped it into my purse that morning, right next to my lipstick, and a receipt from the wine bar we used to love. He was downstairs already, talking to the PR team, wearing the navy suit I bought for his first investor meeting. I watched from the stairs, not angry, not shaking. Just clear. People always think revenge feels like fire, but sometimes it's ice, clean, precise. Like flipping a switch. The dress, the email, the account, the wine. None of them hurt me anymore. They calibrated me. Refined me. By the time he looked up and saw me at the top of the stairs, I was already gone. Not physically, but gone from the part of me that begged to be remembered. He forgot me on paper. He replaced me in public. Now, he would remember me in front of everyone. The invitation came in gold foil. Private founders dinner, Ascend Collection launch weekend. It was meant for VIPs only, major press, potential buyers, friends of the brand, and me. Technically, I wasn't invited, but my legal name was still on the incorporation documents. And someone on the logistics team hadn't updated the list. I RSVP'd without hesitation. No +1, no dietary restrictions, no special seating, just me and the folder in my purse. The dinner was at La Estrella, an old villa-turned-luxury restaurant in the hills. We had gone there once during the early days when we could only afford one appetizer and tap water with lemon. He had said, "One day we'll rent this whole place out, and they'll know your name too." I remembered that as I stepped into the candlelight. Now he was standing beneath an arch of olive branches, shaking hands, laughing with the head of design at Vogue Interiors. His cufflinks glinted in the soft light. His ego wore the same smile it always had, except this time it didn't see me coming. I didn't walk to him, I walked past him. Let the air shift. Let the room catch the scent of unfinished business. Isolde was in a champagne gown, hair slicked back. She looked polished, expensive, curated. She also looked uncomfortable when she saw me. Good. Dorian came over moments later, forced smile, raised brows. "Verena, I didn't think—" "You never do," I said and took a sip of water. I held up the invitation. "No worries. You technically invited me." I saw his jaw shift, not anger, calculation. The kind that only happens when a man knows he's missed a step, and I was about to show him how far off beat he'd gotten. Dinner was plated in 5 courses. He sat at the center, she on his right, I on his left. Strategic seating, I assumed, to prove to the room we were civil, that he wasn't afraid. He should have been. He toasted, talked about legacy, about vision, about the people who believed in this brand before it even had walls. He didn't name names. Of course he didn't. I smiled through the soup, clapped politely after his speech, and waited. Let him think he'd won the optics, that I was here for closure, for dignity. He leaned over at the 3rd course, whispered, "This isn't the place." I leaned closer. "You chose the place, Dorian. You just didn't know the price." His hand tensed around the stem of his wine glass. I passed him a small envelope. "No need to open it here," I said, "but it's the original contract, and the clause you forgot to terminate." He blinked. I let the words land. 51%, I said, still legally mine. He stared like I'd spoken another language. I continued eating. No scene, no drama, just cold facts served alongside roasted sea bass. He excused himself during dessert, went to the patio to call his lawyer. I watched his back stiffen, his pacing increase. And I smiled because the game wasn't over. The check hadn't even arrived yet. The final course was in a dish. It was a decision, as guests sipped espresso and the head of PR thanked everyone I stood. One quiet step forward, glass in hand, folder in purse. "If I may," I said to the room, "just a few words." The host nodded. Dorian froze. Isolde looked like she forgot how to blink. I want to thank you, I said, not for what you've built, but for what you've erased. Murmurs. I turned to the crowd. Behind every brand is a beginning. Behind every man who calls himself founder, there's often a woman who signed the first check. Gasps now, flashes of cameras slowing down. I opened the folder, pulled out the original incorporation form, held it in the air, then handed it to the Vogue Interiors rep. Verified, notarized. Still active, I said. Then I handed out printed statements. One to the investor from Dallas, one to the buyer from Milan, one to the tech blogger live streaming from the back. Follow the numbers, I said. Follow the names. Dorian stepped forward. Verena, stop. I raised one hand. You stopped me 3 years ago, Dorian. Tonight I just pressed play. The room didn't clap. They listened, and that was louder. I didn't look back when I left, because when you own the truth, you don't need applause. You need silence wide enough to rebuild inside it. For a moment, no one moved. The music faded. The servers stood still holding trays of half-melted panna cotta. The Vogue rep flipped through the documents I handed her. The Milan buyer looked up, eyes wide. Dorian stood across from me, jaw clenched, fists low. Not rage. Not yet. It was panic, the kind that sets in when a man realizes the narrative is no longer his. I think we should all take a breath, he said to the room, his voice pitched to calm. I spoke softer. I took a breath 3 years ago, I said, when I sold everything I owned to build this company. I turned slightly, scanning the room. I was erased slowly, in voice, in contract, in presence, a beat. But not in law. Gasps. Phones came out. Someone in the back whispered, "Is this real?" The Vogue editor cleared her throat. "This signature matches all the filings on public record," she said quietly. "She's telling the truth." Isolde stood now. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, glancing at Dorian. "She's bitter, you told me," but she didn't finish. Because the truth was printed in 12-point font on letterhead, with their names and my money. The investor from Dallas closed his folder slowly. "Is this what you meant by streamlined equity?" he asked Dorian. Another silence. Dorian tried to speak, but the room had already pivoted. Questions now flew between guests. Who owns what? What happens next? Can the board intervene? The PR rep checked her watch. Someone from legal stepped into the room, and I sat down, crossed my legs, and sipped my espresso, not as a guest, not as an ex, but as a woman who no longer needed to ask permission to speak. By morning, the press had the story. Silent co-founder reclaims control. During luxury launch dinner, the photo they used was taken just as I handed the documents to the Vogue rep. Dorian blurred in the background. Me center frame, calm, controlled. Exactly how I wanted to be remembered. The board held an emergency meeting 2 days later. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. The vote was swift. Dorian was suspended pending internal investigation. Isolde's contract was mutually terminated. Their statements were cold, corporate, forgettable, unlike mine. I issued no press release, no revenge post, no cryptic caption, just one email to the entire staff. Every beginning has its silence. Thank you for enduring mine. Verena Locke, majority shareholder. I heard Dorian tried to fly to New York the following week to rebuild trust. No one took the meeting. The investors froze all expansion efforts. The Milan buyer withdrew, but I didn't celebrate. I just walked the beach that weekend barefoot in the same sandals I wore the day I closed my condo sale to fund his dream. Only now that dream was mine. The brand kept the name, but the story? It changed forever, because when a woman reclaims what's hers, she doesn't scream. She signs, and lets the world read between the lines. The villa was quiet by spring. Most of the press moved on. The investors found new startups. Even the furniture line rebranded, slightly subtler packaging, softer tones. They left Dorian out of the story. He faded the way men like him do, with enough charm to delay collapse, but not enough substance to survive it. And me, I didn't take over the company. I didn't need to. I appointed a new CEO, someone who listened more than he spoke. I stayed on the board, but from a distance. I wasn't interested in building empires anymore, just boundaries. I bought back a small condo in San Luis Obispo. Not the same one. This one had a garden that bloomed earlier, quieter neighbors, better light. Mabel, my old rescue dog, had passed the year Dorian launched the company, but last week I adopted another. Her name is Olive. She likes basil and sunlight. People ask if I regret it. The money, the years, the silence. I don't. Because sometimes the cost of clarity is everything you used to cling to. And once you let go, what remains is only what was ever truly yours. I don't tell the story for pity or praise or clicks. I tell it so that someone somewhere who's watching herself disappear piece by piece knows she's not crazy. And she's not alone. If that's you, don't wait for the applause. Don't beg for credit. Just take back what's yours and walk away slow enough that they feel every step. Some people think taking back what's yours looks like courtrooms or press conferences or shouting matches in marble lobbies. But for me, it looked like reading emails at 6 a.m. from a quiet cafe. It looked like deleting his name from my emergency contact. It looked like learning how to be powerful and still gentle with myself. That was the part no one saw. After the dinner, after the vote, after the headlines, there was silence. The kind that doesn't echo, it settles. I stayed silent for 3 weeks, didn't speak to media, didn't reply to "you go girl" texts from people who never showed up when it hurt. Instead, I walked. I went to the farmer's market. I replanted basil on the windowsill. I made risotto by myself for the first time in years, without waiting to see if someone else liked the texture. I began remembering who I was, before his dream started wearing my skin. Back then, I thought love meant giving everything. Now I know the most powerful thing a woman can give is nothing more. Not another year, not another explanation, not another try. I didn't need closure from him. I needed return on emotional investment. And I gave that to myself. Slowly, the company still uses the designs I helped shape, but now they pay licensing fees directly into a trust I built under my name. That trust, it's funding a program for female founders who gave too much. There are dozens of them. Women who traded names for promises, shares for affection, ownership for belonging. They don't cry when they talk. They clench their jaws, like I used to. I tell them what I wish someone had told me sooner. If you have to shrink to be loved, it's not love, it's branding. Sometimes they laugh. Sometimes they exhale like it's the first real breath all week. Sometimes they just nod. One of them, Kira, sent me a message last week. He stole my voice in board meetings, she wrote, but I finally recorded my own story, and I'm pitching it at the next summit. I smiled for the rest of the day. Not because I saved her, but because she remembered who she was, just like I did. The funny thing is, Dorian never reached out. Not a letter, not a voicemail, not a half-hearted apology laced with ego. I think he knew better. Men like him don't apologize, they reinvent. But this time, there was no audience left to clap. He moved cities, I heard. Tried to launch a podcast about design and masculinity. It tanked in under 6 months. I didn't gloat. Because healing doesn't require your enemy to lose. It just requires you to no longer care who's watching. Last week, I walked by the old office building. The glass door still had the etched logo, his signature design. But when I pressed my palm against it, it didn't sting anymore. It just felt like glass. Clear, cold, and not mine. I kept walking. That's the part no one ever films. The quiet exit. The woman who chooses not to return even when she legally could. Because she's already reclaimed the only thing that ever mattered, herself. A few months later, I got an invitation in the mail. A mutual friend, someone who never picked sides, was launching her own boutique showroom in Ojai. I thought about ignoring it, not because of her, but because I wasn't sure how to enter a room anymore without wondering who still saw me as his ex instead of herself. But I went. I wore flats, no makeup, simple linen dress with pockets deep enough for keys and nothing else. And when I walked through the door, people smiled. Not the tight-lipped, so sorry about everything kind of smile, but real ones. Like I'd just been a woman living her life, not a footnote in someone else's flameout. We talked about fabric and lighting, and the strange joy of getting older and caring less about centerpieces. Someone asked what I was doing next. I shrugged, simplifying. They laughed, then nodded because they knew what that meant. Not downsizing, not quitting, just living without performance. Last week I found the original sketch of the Isolde, the wedding dress that never was. I almost threw it out, but then I turned the paper over. On the back was a single word Dorian had written once in pencil, Verena. He'd signed it like a thank you, before the ego, before the lies. I didn't rip it, didn't keep it either. I burned it, one clean flame, no photos, no ceremony. Just the soft hiss of goodbye to something that no longer deserved memory. And as the paper curled to ash, I realized there are stories the world needs to hear, and others we only need to finish for ourselves. This was one of those. And now it's done.